There's a photograph that most people who've seen it can't quite describe afterward. Not because it's graphic, not because it's blurry, but because what's in it doesn't fit into any category the human mind has a clean word for. It was taken by an automated trail camera mounted to a pine tree at approximately 4,000 feet elevation in the southern Sierra Nevada range, in the national forest land adjacent to Sequoia, on a Tuesday morning in early October. The camera was motion-triggered. It caught what it caught, logged a timestamp, and went back to waiting. When a forestry technician reviewed the footage weeks later, he flagged it immediately. Then he called his supervisor. Then his supervisor called someone else. The photograph showed a woman. She was crouched low to the ground. Her hair was matted and long and pale with what appeared to be dry clay. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at something in the trees behind it. And the thing that no one in that chain of phone calls could easily explain was this. The woman in that photograph had been reported missing 22 months earlier, 312 miles away. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Her name, for the purposes of this account, is Carol Ames. She was 44 years old when she disappeared. She had a daughter in college in Sacramento, a rented house on the edge of a small town in the high desert east of Bakersfield, and a job she'd held for 11 years at a county records office where, by all accounts, she was reliable, quiet, and precise. She was not someone people worried about. That's the part her co-workers kept returning to in the weeks after she vanished. They didn't worry about Carol. She was the kind of person who made other people feel like worrying was unnecessary. She had lived in that high desert town for about 9 years at the time she disappeared. She'd moved there after a divorce, chose it almost at random from a map, and stayed because the rent was low and the winters were dry and the nearest large city was far enough away that she never felt obligated to go. Her daughter, Megan, described her mother's life there as deliberately small. Not depressingly small. Deliberately. Carol had, over the years, reduced her life to things she could manage and trust. She drove the same route to work every morning. She kept a garden that she documented obsessively with photographs. Not for anyone else, just for herself. She called Megan every Sunday between 7 and 8 in the evening, without exception. The last call came on a Sunday in late November. Megan remembered it later as unremarkable. Her mother had talked about the garden going dormant for the winter, about a co-worker who brought in a fruitcake no one wanted to be rude about a bird she'd seen at the feeder that she couldn't identify. She seemed fine. She seemed like Carol. They said goodnight, and that was the last Megan heard from her for nearly 2 years. By Wednesday of that same week, Carol hadn't shown up for work. Her supervisor waited until Thursday to call her home number. No answer. He called again Friday morning, and then, because Carol had never missed a day without calling, he drove to her house at lunchtime. The door was unlocked. Her car was in the driveway. The coffee maker had been left on, though the carafe had long since burned dry. The bed had been slept in. Her purse was on the kitchen table with her wallet and her phone inside it. The initial conclusion from the county sheriff's department was that Carol had walked away voluntarily. This is not as dismissive as it sounds. Adults disappear their own, choosing more often than most people realize, and the circumstances at Carol's house. Unlocked door, car left behind, no signs of struggle, fit a pattern that investigators associate with someone who left in a deliberate but unplanned way. The word they used in early reports was voluntarily missing. They noted her divorce, her isolated lifestyle, her limited social connections. They noted that she had some savings and no outstanding debts. They filed a missing persons report, interviewed Megan, interviewed co-workers, and assigned the case a number. Megan pushed back almost immediately, not angrily. She was measured about it, which made her easier to dismiss. She told investigators that her mother would not leave without telling her. She told them Carol had never once, in 9 years, missed her Sunday call without advance notice. She told them that the coffee maker being left on meant something, because Carol was the kind of person who checked every appliance twice before leaving the house. She was not the kind of person who walked away. Megan said that phrase more than once. She is not the kind of person who walks away. The investigators thanked her for her time. What didn't make the early reports, and what took Megan several weeks to piece together herself, was a small detail from a neighbor 2 streets over. The neighbor, an older man named Dennis who walked his dog every morning along Carroll Street, said he'd seen Carol on a Monday after that last Sunday phone call. Not Wednesday. Monday. She'd been standing in her front yard in the early morning, before 6, just standing there looking north. He'd waved. She'd turned and gone inside. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time. That detail mattered because the working theory had Carol leaving sometime between Sunday evening and Wednesday morning. But if Dennis had seen her Monday morning, standing in her yard and looking at something to the north, that narrowed the window considerably, and it introduced a question no one seemed to follow up on seriously. What was she looking at? North of Carol's house, beyond the last row of residential streets, was open desert scrubland that extended for miles before it hit the base of a low mountain range. There were no roads in that direction, no structures. In the summer, the land was full of rattlesnakes and scrub brush and nothing else. In late November, it was cold at night and the ground was hard. If Carol had walked into that land for any reason, or been walked into it, there would have been nothing there to help her. The sheriff's department conducted what they described as a ground search of the immediate area. They found nothing. They did not, as far as the records indicate, extend the search into the mountain range to the north. 6 weeks after Carol was reported missing, the case was quietly reclassified. It remained an open missing persons case, but was no longer being actively investigated. Megan was told there were no new leads. She was told that adult missing persons cases were complicated. She was told to call if she heard anything. She called every few weeks anyway. For months. Sometimes she got through to the original detective, a man named Hargrove, who seemed to genuinely feel bad about the situation, but had nothing new to tell her. Sometimes she got a different person, who clearly had to look up who Carol Ames was before responding. By spring, the calls were being returned less consistently. By summer, Megan had hired a private investigator with money she'd borrowed from her grandmother. The private investigator's name was Thomas. He was retired law enforcement, careful and methodical, not the kind of person who overpromised. He spent 3 months looking at Carol's case. He interviewed Dennis again, and Dennis added something he hadn't mentioned to the police, or had mentioned and no one had logged. He said that when Carol turned away from looking north that Monday morning, she'd had an expression he found hard to name. He said she didn't look scared, but she didn't look like herself either. He said she looked like someone who had already made a decision and was waiting for the right moment. Thomas tried to pull surveillance footage from a gas station about a mile north of Carol's neighborhood, one of the few cameras with any line of sight toward that direction. He was told the footage had been overwritten. Standard retention policy, 30 days. He asked about dash cam footage from any patrol vehicles that might have been in the area during that window. He was told there was no record of patrol activity in that corridor during the relevant period. He filed a public records request for the full documentation of the initial search. The records he received were 12 pages long. For a missing persons case involving a search of the surrounding terrain, 12 pages is a very small number. Thomas noted in his report to Megan that the investigation appeared to have moved unusually quickly from active to inactive. He didn't speculate about why. He laid it out as a timeline and let her read it. By the following winter, 22 months after Carol disappeared, Megan had largely run out of options. She had filed complaints with 2 state oversight bodies. She had spoken to a local newspaper reporter who ran a brief story that generated some sympathy but no new information. She had driven out to her mother's old neighborhood and sat in the driveway of the now-rented house and tried to understand what she was missing. She was no closer to an answer. And then a forestry technician named Paul, reviewing routine trail camera footage from a wildlife monitoring program in the National Forest above the southern Sierra Nevada, flagged an image he couldn't explain. It's important to understand what trail cameras in that program are designed to capture. They're not security cameras. They're monitoring equipment for wildlife surveys. Deer, bear, mountain lion, the occasional feral hog. They're triggered by motion and heat. They log thousands of images over the course of the season, most of them empty forests, some of them animals, a few of them hikers who wandered off marked trails. A human figure in a trail camera image by itself is not unusual. A human figure in a trail camera image at 4,000 feet elevation in the national forest adjacent to Sequoia in early October, crouched low to the ground with matted clay-covered hair, not looking at the camera, apparently alone, at 6:23 in the morning. That was unusual. That was the kind of image Paul flagged and called his supervisor about. The woman in the image was not in hiking gear. She was wearing what appeared to be layered clothing, though it was so dirty and degraded that it was difficult to identify individual garments. She was barefoot. She appeared to be examining something on the ground, a track, possibly, or a plant, or simply the soil itself. Her posture was not the posture of someone lost or injured or frightened. It was the posture of someone who was exactly where they intended to be. Forestry staff shared the image with the county sheriff's office. The county compared it against open missing persons cases. The comparison was made, in part, through a height estimate derived from Carol's proximity to a fallen log in the image, cross-referenced with her documented height in the missing persons report. The comparison also involved what Megan later described as a nearly physical shock when she was shown the image and asked if she recognized the woman. She said yes. Immediately, without hesitation, she said she recognized the way her mother held her hands. A search team was organized within 48 hours of the identification. Not a casual search. A coordinated effort involving forestry staff familiar with the terrain, a search and rescue unit, and 2 trackers with experience in wilderness recovery. They returned to the area around the trail camera. They found signs of long-term habitation, a natural rock shelter that had been reinforced with branches and packed debris, a fire pit that was cold but had been used extensively over a long period, remnants of food storage that suggested someone who knew how to preserve and cache food through winter. There were no modern supplies, no backpack, no sleeping bag, no water filtration equipment. Whoever had been living there without anything you would intentionally bring. At this point, investigators were left with 2 possibilities. Which one would you have believed? Either Carol Ames had walked away from her life deliberately, traveled over 300 miles without a car or money or a phone, and survived for nearly 2 years in the wilderness with no equipment and no supply runs. Or something else had happened to her, something that deposited her in those mountains in a way that didn't begin with a choice. Both possibilities, when you sit with them long enough, become equally uncomfortable. They found her 4 days after the search began. Not the search team. Actually, a tracker named Rita, working ahead of the main group, who followed what she described as a pattern of disturbed ground that ran along a drainage creek at the base of a granite ridge. She heard movement in the brush above her and stopped. She waited, and Carol Ames came out of the brush above her and stopped too. And they looked at each other for what Rita later estimated was about 30 seconds, though she said it felt much longer. Rita had been briefed. She knew who she was looking for. She said Carol's name. And Carol, by Rita's account, did not react to the name the way a person does when they haven't heard it in a long time. She didn't blink. She didn't soften. She looked at Rita the way you might look at a word in a foreign language that you once knew and have almost entirely forgotten. There was recognition in it, but it was partial, like something seen through fog. She was brought down the mountain over the course of an afternoon. She was cooperative in the sense that she didn't resist. She walked on her own. She ate when food was offered. She didn't speak for the first several hours. When she finally did speak, it was to ask quietly how long it had been. When the search coordinator told her, she nodded. She didn't cry. She didn't express relief or distress or surprise. She nodded the way you nod when someone confirms something you had already calculated. At the regional medical center, the physical examination produced findings that were genuinely difficult to reconcile. Carol was malnourished, but not severely. She was dehydrated. She had healed fractures in 2 fingers on her left hand that had not been treated at any medical facility. They had simply healed on their own, slightly misaligned. She had extensive scarring on the soles of her feet, consistent with years of barefoot movement over rough terrain. The examination team noted that her physical condition was consistent with someone who had been living outdoors for an extended period, but who had adapted to that existence rather than been destroyed by it. She was not a person at the edge of survival. She appeared to have reached a kind of equilibrium with it. The psychiatric evaluation was more complicated, and its full contents were never made public. What was shared through Megan and through statements from the attending physicians was this: Carol was oriented. She knew who she was. She knew who Megan was. She could recall her life before disappearing in coherent detail up to a certain point, and then the memory became fragmented and nonlinear. She could not give a clear account of how she had come to be in the mountains. She could not identify a single moment of decision or event that had preceded her being there. The physicians used the phrase dissociative amnesia in at least one document that Megan was shown, but they were careful to frame it as a possibility, not a conclusion. Megan spent a week at the hospital. She described her mother as present but altered, not the way people mean when they say someone has changed. Carol recognized her, responded to her, made jokes at appropriate moments, asked after specific people in Megan's life. The alteration was subtler than that. It was more like meeting someone who had translated themselves into a second language, and the translation was excellent, but you could feel the distance between the original and the version in front of you. Carol's account of her time in the mountains, in the sessions that were shared with family, was fragmentary. She remembered cold. She remembered the sound of forest at night, not as a frightening thing, but as something she had learned to read, the way you learn to read traffic or weather. She remembered learning where water was. She remembered making choices about shelter and warmth and food with calm efficiency that she described as not feeling like choices. She said it was more like following a logic that had already been worked out before she thought about it. She said she could not tell Megan how she had gotten there. She said she had tried to remember, and the memory wasn't structured. It wasn't that it was missing. It was that it didn't have a beginning. The detective originally assigned to her missing persons case, Hargrove, visited once. He asked careful questions. Carol answered what she could. When he asked her about the Monday morning her neighbor had seen her looking north, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said she remembered being in the yard. She remembered the cold. She remembered something that she described only as understanding something. She couldn't elaborate. She said it wasn't a decision so much as a recognition. Hargrove wrote it down. He didn't push. He thanked her for her time and left, and the case file, as far as anyone could determine, was never formally resolved. It remains open. It remains, functionally, as unanswered as the day Megan first walked into the sheriff's office. There are things that are simply true about this case. Carol disappeared. She survived, in genuine wilderness, for nearly 2 years without equipment. A trail camera caught her image, and she was brought back. She is alive. She is with her daughter. These are the confirmed facts, and they are the easy part. The harder part is everything that doesn't fit around them. The 12-page search record. The surveillance footage that was overwritten before it could be reviewed. The absence of any evidence Carol had traveled the 300 miles between her home and the mountains. No sightings, no transaction records, nothing. The neighbor's observation about her expression that morning. The healed fractures that suggested she had been in the wilderness long enough to sustain and recover from injury without returning to any populated area. The medical finding that she had not simply survived the wilderness, but adapted to it in ways that usually take much longer than 22 months. You can build explanations around each of these things individually. She traveled at night, or was given rides by people who didn't know her situation. The footage was overwritten on schedule, coincidentally. The search record was minimal because the search was minimal, and the search was minimal because the assumption of voluntary departure reduced urgency. The adaptation could be explained by a combination of prior outdoor experience, though Carol's known history showed very little, and a remarkable resilience the human body can develop under sustained pressure. Each explanation is possible. What's harder to resolve is why all of these things are present in the same case, in the same direction, all pointing away from clarity. Thomas, the private investigator, was interviewed by Megan after Carol's return. He had a measured way of framing it. He said that in his experience, cases with as many small inconsistencies usually had one of two explanations. Either something deliberate happened that no one wanted looked at closely, or something happened that no one could explain, and both the individuals involved and the institutions around them made a collective and quiet decision to accept the outcome and stop asking. He said he had seen both, and he said both were more common than people wanted to believe. Megan asked him which he thought applied here. He said he didn't know. He said he wasn't sure the distinction mattered as much as people assumed, because the result in either case was the same. A woman had been missing for nearly 2 years, had survived something that shouldn't have been survivable without explanation, had returned without an account anyone could fully verify, and the official response was to file it and move on. Carol, for her part, has not given any public interviews. She lives now in a different town, closer to Megan, in a house with a yard she has begun to garden again. Megan has said her mother is better than she expected. She has also said there are things her mother will say in passing, small things, that Megan hasn't been able to interpret. Not frightening things. Just things that don't quite land in the context of an ordinary conversation. References to ways of moving through space that suggest a fluency with wilderness that shouldn't be there. Observations about animal behavior that are unusually precise. An ease with silence that Carol didn't have before. Megan doesn't know what happened to her mother. Carol may not know either. The honest answer is that no one has looked hard enough to find out, and the window in which looking hard would have mattered has mostly closed. The trail camera image is still in the forestry program's archive files. The rock shelter in the mountains was documented, but then left. No formal study was made of it. No archaeologist or forensic specialist was brought in to assess how long it had been occupied or what had been there before Carol. The search team recovered nothing from the site. They brought Carol down the mountain and left everything else where it was. This is the part of the story that the documented record can't explain, and that no one has officially tried to. Not because it's impossible, because no one has asked. The questions that would need to be answered to understand what happened to Carol Ames are still sitting there unanswered, in a way that doesn't feel like an accident. It feels like something that was allowed to remain unanswered. You can disagree with that. You can look at the available facts and conclude that a woman had a psychological crisis, walked away from her life, survived through a combination of luck and instinct, and was eventually found. That's a complete story. It fits the facts. It requires no additional explanation. But you would have to stop asking about the 12 pages. You would have to stop asking about the footage. You would have to stop asking about how a woman with no documented wilderness experience and no equipment survived a Sierra Nevada winter at altitude and came out of it adapted rather than broken. You would have to stop asking why the investigation moved from active to inactive as quickly as it did, and why the questions Megan raised early on were answered with such consistent, patient, unhelpful calm. You would have to decide that all of those things are coincidences. And maybe they are. Coincidences are real. Institutions fail through negligence more often than through design. People survive things they shouldn't survive, and sometimes they can't explain how afterward. All of this is true. But Carol Ames looked north from her yard at something on a cold Monday morning in late November, and whatever she saw or understood or recognized in that moment sent her, somehow, in some way that has never been accounted for, over 300 miles into the wilderness, where she lived alone for nearly 2 years, and came out with change in ways her own daughter can feel but cannot name. And somewhere in National Forest, in the rocks above a drainage creek below a granite ridge, there's a shelter that someone built and lived in and left, and no one has gone back to look at it carefully. And the case file is open and active, and Carol Ames is gardening in a new town, and her daughter watches her sometimes across the yard with feelings she can't quite put words to. Cases like this don't disappear. They just fade when people stop asking questions. If something in the story didn't sit right with you, a detail that felt unfinished, a question that opened up where an answer should have been, leave it in the comments. Not because it will change anything, but because the alternative is silence. And silence is exactly what this case has had enough of